The gunshot that split the evening air didn't belong to an outlaw or a lawman, but to Katherine Anne's father, crumpling to the dusty ground outside their modest ranch house, 3 miles south of Pinos Altos, New Mexico. And in that moment, everything she had ever known shattered like glass under a boot heel. It was September 1878, and Katherine had just turned 21 the week before. Her father, Thomas Anne, had been a fair man, a rancher who worked his land honestly and treated his few hired hands with respect. He owed money to no one, made enemies of nobody, and yet someone had ridden onto their property in the fading light of dusk and put a bullet through his chest before riding away into the gathering darkness. Katherine ran from the house, her skirts tangling around her legs as she fell to her knees beside him. His eyes were already glazing over, his breathing shallow and wet. He tried to speak, managed only to grip her hand with surprising strength, and then he was gone. She screamed until her throat burned raw, until the ranch hand, Miguel, came running from the barn, until the reality of her situation settled over her like a funeral shroud. The sheriff came the next morning, a portly man named Henderson, who looked at her father's body with professional detachment and wrote things down in a small notebook. He asked questions Katherine couldn't properly answer because she had been inside making supper, because she hadn't seen the rider clearly in the dimming light, because she had no idea who would want her father dead. Henderson promised to investigate, tipped his hat, and rode back toward town. She never heard from him again about the matter. The funeral was small. Her father had been well liked but kept to himself mostly, and Katherine's mother had died of fever when she was only 7. There were no siblings, no aunts or uncles nearby. Miguel and his wife Rosa came, along with a handful of townspeople who knew her father from church. The preacher said words that meant nothing to Katherine's grief-stricken mind, and then Thomas Anne was buried on a hillside overlooking the ranch he had built with his own 2 hands. The trouble started a week later, when a man named Vernon Sutherland showed up at her door with 3 rough-looking companions. Vernon was a land speculator, a man who wore expensive suits that looked out of place in the New Mexico territory, and spoke with a smooth confidence that immediately set Katherine's teeth on edge. "Miss Anne," he said, removing his hat with exaggerated courtesy, "I'm terribly sorry about your father. A tragic accident." "It wasn't an accident," Katherine said coldly, standing in the doorway with her father's rifle propped against the frame within easy reach. "Someone murdered him." Vernon's expression didn't change. Murder is such an ugly word. "Regardless, I'm here because your father and I had an arrangement. He owed me a substantial sum of money, and with his passing, that debt falls to you." Katherine's blood went cold. "My father didn't owe anyone anything. He said so himself just days before he died." "I have papers that say otherwise," Vernon replied, producing a folded document from his jacket. "Signed by your father 6 months ago. He borrowed $5,000 to expand his operation. The note comes due in 2 weeks, Miss Anne. I'm willing to be reasonable given your circumstances. Sign over the deed to this property and we'll call the debt settled." She looked at the papers, at her father's signature scrawled at the bottom. Something about it looked wrong, the letters slightly too careful, too precise. Her father's handwriting had always been a hasty scrawl, barely legible. But she was no expert, and Vernon had the document notarized by someone whose seal looked official enough. "I need time to think," Katherine said. 2 weeks, Vernon replied, his smile not reaching his eyes. "After that, I'll have the sheriff enforce the debt collection." "I'd hate to see you lose everything because of pride, Miss Anne." After they left, Katherine sat at her father's desk and went through every paper, every ledger, every receipt she could find. There was no record of any loan, No mention of Vernon Sutherland anywhere in her father's meticulous accounts. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Vernon had forged the document, and she was willing to bet he had something to do with her father's death. But proving it was another matter entirely, especially when the law seemed uninterested in investigating. Miguel was sympathetic but realistic when she told him. "Señorita Catherine, men like Sutherland, they always win. They have money, lawyers, judges in their pockets. If you fight him, you will lose everything anyway and maybe your life too." "I can't just give up my father's ranch," Catherine said, her voice breaking. "It's all I have left of him." "Then you need help," Miguel said. "Real help. Someone who isn't afraid of men like Sutherland." "Who?" "The sheriff won't do anything. The territorial marshal is probably paid off too." Miguel hesitated, then said, "There is a man, a cowboy who worked for the Castillo ranch north of here last year. His name is Quinton Walker. The vaqueros say he is very good with a gun, but more importantly, he is an honest man. He helped Señor Castillo when land grabbers tried to steal his water rights. Maybe he can help you." Catherine had heard of Quinton Walker, though they had never met. Stories drifted through the territory about a tall cowboy with steady hands and steadier principles. A man who hired his gun for protection, but never for murder, who stood up for small ranchers against the big operators trying to squeeze them out. Some said he was from Texas originally. Others claimed Colorado. No one seemed to know much about his past, but his reputation was solid. "Where can I find him?" Catherine asked. "Last I heard, he was in Pino's Altos at the Lucky Star Saloon. He sometimes plays cards there when he is between jobs." Catherine made her decision quickly. She changed into her riding clothes, a practical split skirt and sturdy blouse, checked that her father's old revolver was loaded, and saddled her mare. Miguel tried to argue that she should wait, that he would go into town instead, but Catherine was done waiting, done letting others handle her problems. If this Quinton Walker could help her, she needed to look him in the eye and judge for herself. The ride into Pino's Altos took just over an hour. The town had sprung up around the gold mines in the area, though by 1878, most of the easily accessible ore had been exhausted. What remained was a rough collection of buildings clustered along a main street, with the Lucky Star Saloon being the largest and most prosperous-looking establishment. Catherine tied her horse outside and pushed through the swinging doors. The interior was dim and smelled of tobacco smoke, spilled beer, and unwashed bodies. A dozen men occupied various tables, playing cards or drinking. A few looked up when she entered, their eyes lingering with a mixture of curiosity and speculation. Women didn't often come into the Lucky Star, at least not respectable women. "Help you, miss?" the bartender asked, a grizzled man with suspicious eyes. "I'm looking for Quinton Walker," Catherine said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Back corner," the bartender said, jerking his thumb toward the rear of the saloon. Catherine made her way through the tables, ignoring the stares and low comments. In the back corner, she found a man sitting alone with his back to the wall, a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a worn deck of cards on the table in front of him. He was watching her approach with eyes that were intensely blue even in the dim light, his expression unreadable. Quinton Walker was probably in his late 20s, with dark hair that needed cutting and several days' worth of stubble on his strong jaw. He wore dusty range clothes and a leather vest, with a well-maintained Colt revolver holstered at his hip. There was something about the way he held himself, a coiled readiness that suggested he could move very fast if needed, but also a calmness that made Catherine feel slightly less anxious. "Mr. Walker?" she asked, stopping at his table. "That depends on who's asking and why," he replied. His voice was deep and measured with a slight Texas drawl. "My name is Katherine Anne. Miguel Rodriguez from the Castillo Ranch said you might be able to help me." Quinton studied her for a long moment, then gestured to the chair across from him. "Sit down, Miss Anne. Tell me what kind of trouble you're in." Katherine sat and told him everything, the words tumbling out faster as she went. Her father's murder, Vernon Sutherland's claim of debt, the forged papers, the 2-week deadline. Quinton listened without interrupting, his eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, turning his whiskey glass in slow circles on the table. "You understand that if Sutherland had your father killed, proving it will be nearly impossible," Quinton said finally. "Men like him don't do their own dirty work, and hired guns don't tend to confess." "I know," Katherine said, "but I can't just let him steal my father's ranch. I can't let him get away with murder." "What exactly do you want me to do?" "Help me find proof that the loan papers are forged." "Help me make Sutherland back down. I can pay you." She named a sum that was nearly everything she had in her father's safe, money saved for emergencies. This certainly qualified. Quinton shook his head. "Keep your money for now. Let me look into this first. If I can help, we'll work something out." "If I can't, there's no point in taking your money." Katherine felt a rush of relief so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Walker. Thank you so much." "Don't thank me yet," Quinton said, but there was something gentler in his expression now. "I haven't done anything worth thanking. Where are you staying tonight?" "I was planning to ride back to the ranch. It's getting late, and the roads aren't safe after dark, especially for a woman alone. There's a boarding house run by Mrs. Fletcher on the north end of town. She's respectable and her rates are fair. Stay there tonight, and I'll ride out to your place tomorrow morning to look things over." Katherine wanted to argue that she could take care of herself, but the truth was she was exhausted, emotionally and physically. The thought of a real bed instead of the long ride home in darkness was appealing. She nodded and stood. "Thank you again, Mr. Walker. I'll see you tomorrow." She was almost to the door when his voice stopped her. "Miss Anne, be careful. If Sutherland killed your father over that land, he won't hesitate to come after you too." The words should have frightened her more than they did, but instead Katherine just felt a cold determination settling into her bones. "I'll be careful," she promised, and walked out into the night. Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house was easy to find. A neat 2-story building with clean curtains in the windows and a small flower garden out front that was managing to survive despite the dry climate. Mrs. Fletcher herself was a widow in her 50s who asked no questions when Katherine requested a room for the night. Just showed her upstairs to a small but comfortable space with a real mattress and clean sheets. Katherine lay awake for a long time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about her father, about the ranch, about the blue-eyed cowboy, who had agreed to help her without even knowing if she was telling the truth. She wondered what kind of man agreed to fight someone else's battles for no guaranteed payment, wondered what had shaped Quinton Walker into someone willing to stand against men like Vernon Sutherland. Sleep came eventually, restless, and filled with dreams of gunshots and her father's dying eyes. Quinton Walker arrived at the Anne Ranch just after dawn, riding a rangy buckskin gelding that looked like it could run all day without tiring. Katherine was already up, dressed in her work clothes and feeding the chickens when she heard hoofbeats. She walked around from the back of the house to find Quinton dismounting near the porch. "Morning, Miss Anne," he said, tying his horse to the rail. "Morning, Mr. Walker. Would you like some coffee? I just made a fresh pot. Coffee would be appreciated." They sat at the kitchen table, the morning light streaming through the windows and illuminating the simple but well-maintained interior. Quinton accepted the cup she offered and drank it black, his eyes moving around the room, taking in details. "Your father built this place himself?" he asked. "Most of it. He bought the land 15 years ago, just raw territory. Built the house, the barn, dug the well. Everything you see he made with his own hands and honest work." "It's a good piece of property," Quinton said. "I can see why Sutherland wants it. There's water here, good grazing. This close to town, it's valuable." Katherine pulled out the papers Vernon had left, spreading them on the table. Quinton studied them carefully, holding one up to the light from the window, running his finger over the signature. "This signature is a forgery," he said after several minutes. "A good one, but still a forgery. See how the ink is slightly different shade here, and the pressure is too even. When people sign their name naturally, there are variations in how hard they press the pen. This was copied carefully, probably traced." "Can we prove that?" Katherine asked hopefully. "Maybe. We'd need other examples of your father's signature, and we'd need a judge willing to look at the evidence. That's the harder part. Sutherland likely has connections with the territorial judge, but there's something else here." He pointed to the notary seal at the bottom of the document. "This seal belongs to a notary named Albert Griggs. I know him. He's honest, or was last time I dealt with him. If Sutherland forged this document, either Griggs was paid off or someone forged his seal too." "So what do? We go talk to Griggs." "He has an office above the general store in Silver City. That's about a day's ride from here. If he didn't notarize this document, if someone forged his seal, that's evidence we can use." Katherine stood immediately. "I'll pack some supplies for the journey. Miss Anne, this could be dangerous. If Sutherland finds out we're investigating, he might move against you faster." "This is my fight, Mr. Walker. I'm not going to hide while someone else handles it for me." Quinton looked at her for a long moment, and something like respect flickered in his blue eyes. "All right then. Pack light. We'll camp tonight and reach Silver City tomorrow afternoon." They set out within the hour, Katherine on her mare and Quinton on his buckskin. Miguel had agreed to watch the ranch while they were gone, though he looked worried about Katherine traveling alone with a man she barely knew. But Katherine trusted her instincts, and everything about Quinton Walker suggested he was exactly what Miguel had claimed, an honest man in a territory where such men were increasingly rare. They rode in comfortable silence for the first few hours, the New Mexico landscape stretching out around them in shades of brown and gold, punctuated by scrub brush and the occasional juniper tree. The September heat was fierce but bearable, and they stopped frequently to rest the horses and drink from their canteens. It was during one of these rest stops, sitting in the shade of a rocky outcrop, that Katherine finally asked the question that had been on her mind since meeting him. "Why did you agree to help me? You don't know me. You have no reason to believe I'm telling the truth." Quinton was quiet for a moment, staring out at the horizon. "I knew your father a little, met him in town a few times, had a few conversations. He struck me as an honest man, the kind who wouldn't borrow money unless he absolutely had to, and the kind who'd pay it back if he did. When you told me about the loan, it didn't fit with the man I'd observed. And I've seen men like Sutherland before. They come into the territory with money and lawyers and think they can take whatever they want from the people who actually built something here. Someone needs to stand up to them, or they'll own everything." "Is that what happened to you?" Katherine asked gently. "Did someone like Sutherland take something from you?" Quinton's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My father had a ranch in Texas. Not big, but enough. A big operator wanted the land for his cattle operation, made offers that my father refused. One day, my father's barn burned down with half his herd trapped inside. The sheriff called it an accident. 6 months later, My father couldn't keep up with the losses and sold the ranch for a fraction of what it was worth, to the same man who'd made the original offer. My father died a year later, just gave up, stopped wanting to live. I'm sorry, Katherine said, meaning it. It was a long time ago. I was 18, angry, stupid. I almost went after the man who destroyed my father, almost got myself killed or hanged for murder. An old ranger talked sense into me, taught me that fighting back doesn't mean becoming a killer. It means standing with the people who need help, using a gun for protection instead of revenge. I've tried to live by that ever since. Katherine felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition of shared pain and shared determination. Thank you for telling me that, and thank you for standing with me. Quinton met her eyes, and for the first time since they'd met, he smiled. It transformed his face, made him look younger and less guarded. You remind me of my father, the way he was before he gave up. You've got that same stubborn fire. I don't think Sutherland knows what he's up against. They made camp that evening in a small canyon that offered shelter and concealment. Quinton built a small fire while Katherine unpacked the food supplies she'd brought, salt pork and beans and hardtack. It wasn't fancy, but after a long day in the saddle, it tasted good enough. They ate in companionable silence, and afterward, Katherine cleaned the dishes in the small stream that ran through the canyon while Quinton checked on the horses. You should get some sleep, Quinton said when she returned to the fire. I'll take first watch. Watch for what? No one knows we're out here. Maybe, maybe not, but it's better to be careful. I'll wake you in a few hours and you can take second watch. Katherine wrapped herself in her bedroll near the fire and closed her eyes, but sleep was slow to come. She was intensely aware of Quinton sitting nearby, his back against a rock, his rifle across his lap. There was something comforting about his presence, a sense of safety she hadn't felt since before her father died. She found herself wondering about him, about the life he'd led wandering the territory, about whether he ever got lonely. She must have dozed off because the next thing she knew, Quinton was gently shaking her shoulder. The fire had burned down to coals and the stars overhead were brilliant in the clear night sky. Your turn, he said quietly. Wake me if you hear anything unusual, even if you're not sure, and stay alert. He settled into his own bedroll on the other side of the fire, and within minutes, his breathing had evened out into sleep. Katherine sat watch with the rifle he'd left for her, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Coyotes yipped in the distance, and once she heard the scream of a mountain lion somewhere in the hills, but nothing came near their camp. As the stars wheeled slowly overhead, Katherine thought about the question she'd asked Quinton earlier that day, about why he'd agreed to help her. But she realized she could ask herself the same question in a different way. Why had she trusted him so quickly? Why did she feel safe with this man she barely knew? The answer came quietly, settling into her heart like something that had always been there waiting to be recognized. Because he saw her as someone capable, someone worth listening to. Because he hadn't tried to take over or tell her what to do, just offered to stand beside her. Because when he looked at her, she didn't see pity or dismissal in his eyes, just respect. And because, if she was being honest with herself, there was something about Quinton Walker that made her heart beat a little faster, made her very aware of his presence in a way that had nothing to do with safety and everything to do with the set of his shoulders, the steadiness of his hands, the rare smile that transformed his face. She was developing feelings for him, Katherine realized with a start. Real feelings, not just gratitude or relief at having help. The realization should have worried her, considering everything else happening in her life, but instead it felt almost natural, like recognizing the change of seasons. Dawn came slowly, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Katherine woke Quinton, and they broke camp efficiently, eating a cold breakfast and saddling the horses as the sun rose over the eastern hills. They reached Silver City by early afternoon, riding into a town that was significantly larger than Pino's Altos, with real streets and substantial buildings. The general store was easy to find, and they climbed the outside stairs to the second floor where Albert Griggs maintained his office. The notary was a small, nervous-looking man with wire-rimmed spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up from his desk when they entered, his expression shifting from curious to worried when he saw Quinton. "Mr. Walker," Griggs said, his voice higher-pitched than Katherine expected. "I heard you were in the area. What can I do for you?" Quinton placed the loan document on the desk. "Did you notarize this paper, Mr. Griggs?" Griggs picked it up, studied it, and his face went pale. "No, absolutely not. I've never seen this document before." "That's my seal or a copy of it, but I didn't notarize anything for Thomas Anne. I'd remember that name. I knew Thomas a little, good man." "Someone forged your seal then," Quinton said. "It appears so. This is very serious, Mr. Walker. Forging a notary's seal is a crime." "Who presented you with this document?" "A man named Vernon Sutherland." Griggs went even paler, if that was possible. "Oh no. Oh dear. Mr. Sutherland was here about 2 months ago. He asked me about the process of notarization, said he was curious about the legal requirements for the territory. I showed him some documents as examples. He must have copied my seal somehow." "Would you be willing to testify to that?" Katherine asked. Griggs looked at her, seeming to really see her for the first time. "You're Thomas Anne's daughter. I heard about his death. I'm very sorry, miss. And yes, I'll testify if needed, but you should know that Sutherland has friends in high places. Judge Morrison in particular." "We'll deal with that when we come to it," Quinton said. "For now, I need you to write out a statement saying you didn't notarize this document and that you believe your seal was copied without authorization. Date it and sign it." Griggs nodded and pulled out paper and pen, writing quickly. His hand shook slightly, but his statement was clear and detailed. He signed it with a flourish, then used his real seal to notarize his own statement, which would have been funny under different circumstances. "Thank you, Mr. Griggs," Katherine said, taking the statement carefully. "You're helping me save my father's ranch." "It's the right thing to do," Griggs said, though he still looked nervous. "But please be careful. Sutherland is a dangerous man to cross." They left Silver City with the precious statement secured in Katherine's saddlebag. The ride back felt faster somehow, fueled by the knowledge that they had real evidence now, something concrete to fight with. They made camp again that night in a different location, and this time when they sat by the fire after eating, the conversation flowed more easily. Quinton told her about his years working as a cowboy, driving cattle from Texas to Kansas, working ranches in Colorado and Wyoming, slowly making his way west. He spoke about the people he'd met, the landscapes he'd seen, the jobs he'd taken protecting settlers and small ranchers from those who would prey on them. Katherine told him about growing up on the ranch, about her mother's death, about learning to ride and shoot and manage a household because there was no one else to do it. She spoke about her father's dreams for the ranch, how he'd planned to expand the herd, maybe start breeding horses. How all of that had ended with a single gunshot. "We'll get justice for him," Quinton said quietly. "I promise you that." "Don't make promises you can't keep," Katherine replied, but there was no anger in her voice. "I don't." Quinton met her eyes across the fire. "I've learned not to make promises I'm not willing to die keeping." The intensity in his gaze made Katherine's breath catch. She looked away first, her heart hammering. The air between them felt charged with something unspoken, something that had been building since they'd first sat down at that table in the Lucky Star Saloon. "You should get some sleep," Quinton said, his voice rougher than usual. "I'll take first watch again." Katherine nodded and retreated to her bedroll, but sleep was a long time coming. She lay awake, listening to the crackle of the fire and thinking about blue eyes and rare smiles, and the way her heart felt like it might burst out of her chest every time Quinton looked at her. They arrived back at the ranch late the following morning to find Miguel waiting anxiously. "Señorita Katherine, thank God. Vernon Sutherland was here yesterday with more men. They looked around the property, measured things. He said to tell you that you have 1 week left, not 2. He says the original deadline was counted wrong." Catherine's hands clenched into fists. "He's trying to pressure me, give me less time to respond." "It won't matter," Quinton said calmly. "We have the evidence we need. The question now is how to use it." They spent the rest of the day planning. Quinton suggested they take their evidence to the territorial marshal in Santa Fe, bypassing the local sheriff and judge who were likely in Sutherland's pocket. It would mean another long journey, but it was their best chance at getting a fair hearing. But before they could leave, they needed to secure the ranch. Quinton taught Katherine and Miguel how to set up a watch system, how to prepare the house and barn in case of attack. He checked all the weapons, made sure there was ammunition enough, and drew up firing positions that would give them the best advantage if Sutherland decided to move against them with force. "You really think he'd attack the ranch?" Katherine asked, watching Quinton check the sight on her father's rifle. "I think he's killed once already to get this land. He won't stop now, especially if he realizes we're building a case against him. We need to be prepared for anything." That night, after Miguel had returned to his small house at the edge of the property, Katherine and Quinton sat on the porch in the cooling darkness. The stars were out again, brilliant and countless, and somewhere in the hills a coyote howled. "Can I ask you something?" Katherine said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Of course. Do you ever think about settling down, having your own ranch instead of working for others?" Quinton was quiet for a long moment. "I used to think about it back when I was younger. But the more I drifted, the more it seemed like something meant for other people, not me. I got used to moving, to not putting down roots. It's safer that way, or so I told myself." "Safer how? Can't lose what you don't have. Can't watch another place you love get destroyed." Katherine turned to look at him, his profile outlined by the lamp light from inside the house. "That's not living, though, that's just surviving. There's a difference." "I'm starting to understand that," Quinton said, and when he turned to meet her eyes, there was something vulnerable in his expression, something open and honest that made Katherine's heart ache. She reached out without thinking, covering his hand with hers where it rested on the porch rail. "Thank you for helping me, for standing with me. I don't think I could do this alone." Quinton turned his hand over, lacing his fingers through hers. His palm was calloused and warm, and the simple touch sent electricity racing up Katherine's arm. "You're stronger than you think. But you don't have to be alone. Not anymore." They sat like that for a long time, hands clasped, not speaking but not needing to. The connection between them had moved beyond words into something deeper, something that felt inevitable and right. When Katherine finally went inside to sleep, she lay in her bed touching her palm where his hand had been, smiling in the darkness despite everything else weighing on her heart. The next morning, they prepared to leave for Santa Fe. Miguel would watch the ranch again, this time with his 2 older sons helping. Quinton had given them specific instructions about when to fire warning shots and when to abandon the property if Sutherland came with too many men. Katherine hated the thought of leaving her home vulnerable, but she understood the necessity. If they didn't get the territorial marshal involved, there would be no home left to protect. The journey to Santa Fe took 4 days, following rough roads through mountain passes and high desert plains. They rode long hours, camping at night, falling into an easy rhythm of shared tasks and comfortable silences broken by increasingly personal conversations. Quinton told her about his mother, who had died when he was young, and Katherine shared memories of her own mother, the way she used to sing while cooking, the gentle firmness with which she taught Katherine to sew and read and think for herself. She used to say that a woman in the West needed to be twice as strong and 3 times as smart as any man, just to be treated as an equal, Katherine said. I didn't understand what she meant when I was little, but I do now. Your mother was a wise woman, Quinton replied. And she'd be proud of you, fighting for what's yours instead of just accepting what men like Sutherland decide you deserve. On the 3rd night, they camped near a small stream in the foothills of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. The air was cooler here, pine-scented, and Katherine could hear the water rushing over rocks in the darkness. After they'd eaten and she'd taken first watch, Quinton relieved her, and she lay in her bedroll staring up at the stars visible through the pine branches. Quinton, she said softly, not sure if he was still awake. Yeah. What will you do after this is over, after we've dealt with Sutherland? I haven't thought that far ahead. Will you move on, find another job somewhere else? Another long silence, filled only with the sound of wind in the trees and running water. Then Quinton said, That depends. On what? On whether I have a reason to stay. Katherine's heart started pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. What kind of reason? She heard him move, and then he was closer, his bedroll near enough that she could see his face in the starlight. The kind where maybe someone might want me around, where maybe I could stop running from putting down roots and start building something instead. Quinton. Katherine started, not sure what she wanted to say, how to express the tangle of hope and fear and longing in her chest. You asked me in that saloon what I wanted most, Quinton said quietly. I didn't answer then because I didn't know how, but I've been thinking about it every day since. And I think the answer is a life with you, a life where I wake up in the same place every morning and you're there, where I can help you build that ranch into what your father dreamed it could be, where I'm not just surviving but living. Tears streamed down Katherine's face, though she wasn't sure exactly why she was crying. Relief maybe, or joy, or just the release of tension she'd been holding since her father died. I want that too. I want you to stay. I want us to build something together. Quinton reached out and gently wiped her tears away with his thumb, his touch infinitely careful. Then that's what we'll do, after we save your ranch, after we make Sutherland pay for what he did. We'll build a life together if you'll have me. I'll have you, Katherine whispered, and then he was kissing her, soft and careful at first, then deeper as she responded, her hand coming up to tangle in his hair. It was her first real kiss, and it felt like coming home and setting out on an adventure at the same time. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Quinton rested his forehead against hers. We should probably get some sleep. Tomorrow's a long ride. Probably, Katherine agreed, but neither of them moved for a long time, content to sit close in the darkness, her hand in his, the future stretching out before them full of possibility. They reached Santa Fe late in the afternoon of the 4th day, the old Spanish colonial city spread out in shades of adobe brown and territorial white. The territorial marshal's office was near the plaza, a sturdy building with the seal of New Mexico Territory hanging over the door. Marshal James Carlisle was a weathered man in his 50s with sharp gray eyes, and a reputation for honesty that had survived 3 territorial governors and countless attempts at bribery. He listened to their story without interrupting, examined the forged loan document and Albert Griggs's statement with careful attention, and asked pointed questions that showed he understood exactly what they were dealing with. "Vernon Sutherland," Carlyle said when they'd finished. "I've heard of him. He operates on the edge of the law, uses legitimate-looking paperwork to steal land, intimidates witnesses, bribes local officials when he can. We've suspected him in several suspicious deaths, but never had enough evidence to bring charges. Do we have enough evidence now?" Katherine asked. "For fraud, possibly. For murder," Carlyle shook his head. "Not unless we can tie him directly to your father's death, but the fraud charge might be enough to start unraveling his operation. If I arrest him, if I start investigating his other land deals, we might find other victims willing to testify, other forged documents. It could bring the whole thing down." "When can you arrest him?" Quinton asked. "I'll need a few days to get the proper warrants, coordinate with my deputies. Sutherland has friends in Santa Fe, too, and I need to move carefully. But I'll send word to the sheriff in Pinos Altos to keep an eye on your property in the meantime. Make sure Sutherland doesn't try anything while I'm preparing the case." They left the marshal's office feeling hopeful for the first time since Thomas Anne died. On Quinton's suggestion, they stayed in Santa Fe for 2 nights, renting rooms at a respectable hotel and giving themselves time to rest before the long journey home. Katherine knew people would talk about her traveling with an unmarried man, staying in a hotel even if they had separate rooms, but she found she didn't care much. Her reputation seemed like a small thing compared to justice for her father and the possibility of a future with Quinton. On their second evening in Santa Fe, Quinton took her to a small restaurant near the plaza. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and the food was good, real cooked meals instead of trail rations. They sat at a corner table, and halfway through the meal, Quinton reached across and took her hand. "Katherine, I need to say something before we go back, before things get complicated again with Sutherland and the marshal and everything else." "All right," Katherine said, her heart speeding up. "I'm not a rich man. I've got some money saved, enough to be useful, but nothing like what a woman like you deserves. I've spent my life drifting, taking jobs where I could find them, never settling anywhere. I've got no family to speak of, no property, no prospects beyond the gun on my hip and the skills I've learned. But I love you. I fell in love with you the moment you walked into that saloon, looking scared but determined, ready to fight for what was yours. And if you'll have me, if you'll marry me once this is all over, I promise I'll spend the rest of my life making you happy, helping you build that ranch into something your father would be proud of." Katherine's vision blurred with tears again, happy tears this time. "Quinton Walker, I don't care about money or prospects. I care that you're honest, that you're brave, that you see me as an equal and a partner. And I love you too, more than I thought possible to love someone I've only known a few weeks. Yes, I'll marry you. Yes to everything." Quinton's face split into a grin so wide and genuine that Katherine started laughing through her tears. He came around the table and pulled her up into his arms, kissing her right there in the restaurant, while other diners looked on with expressions ranging from disapproval to amusement. When they finally broke apart, both of them laughing, Quinton said, "I don't have a ring. I'll get you one as soon as I can, something proper." "I don't need a ring right now," Katherine said, holding his face in her hands. "I just need you." They walked back to the hotel hand in hand, and when they reached Katherine's door, Quinton kissed her goodnight with a tenderness that made her knees weak. "Sleep well. Tomorrow we start home, and then we finish this thing with Sutherland so we can start our real life together." The ride back to Pinos Altos felt faster somehow, fueled by hope and love, and the promise of a future they would build together. They talked about everything: making plans for the ranch, discussing how they'd expand the herd, maybe start growing some crops in the irrigible bottomland near the stream. Quinton wanted to bring in some good breeding stock for horses, and Katherine loved the idea, remembering how her father had always admired fine horses. They were still 2 days from home when they spotted smoke on the horizon, a dark smudge against the clear blue sky. Quinton pulled his horse up short, his expression going hard. "That's coming from the direction of your ranch," he said. They rode hard, pushing the horses faster than was wise, fear driving them forward. As they got closer, the smoke became more distinct, black and thick. Catherine's heart was in her throat, images of her home burning flooding her mind. They crested the final hill and saw it. The barn was on fire, flames reaching high into the sky, smoke billowing. The house appeared intact, and Katherine could see figures moving around. Miguel and his sons trying to control the blaze with buckets of water from the well. But there were other figures too, men on horseback at the edge of the property, watching, Vernon Sutherland and 6 hired guns. Quinton pulled his rifle from its scabbard as they rode down the hill. "Stay behind me. If shooting starts, get to the house and find cover." "I can shoot," Katherine said, drawing her father's revolver. "I know you can. But please let me handle this if possible. I don't want you hurt." They rode into the yard at a gallop, pulling up between the burning barn and Sutherland's men. The hired guns immediately drew their weapons, but Quinton ignored them, his attention fixed on Sutherland. "You're trespassing, Sutherland," Quinton said coldly. "And I'm guessing you're responsible for that fire." "I'm on my property," Sutherland replied, though he looked less confident than he had the first time Katherine saw him. "Miss Anne's deadline passed 3 days ago. This ranch belongs to me now." The deadline on a forged loan document. Katherine said, riding up beside Quinton despite his warning. "We have proof that document is fake. The notary whose seal you copied has made a statement to the territorial marshal. Marshal Carlisle is preparing arrest warrants for you right now." Sutherland's face went pale, then flushed red with anger. "You're bluffing." "We rode to Santa Fe and back," Quinton said. "Spoke to Marshal Carlisle directly. He's very interested in your land deals, all of them. Thinks he might find other forged documents, other victims. By my guess, you've got maybe 3 more days before he shows up here to arrest you." For a long moment, no one moved. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the nervous shifting of horses. Then Sutherland made a gesture, a small movement with his hand, and his hired guns started to raise their weapons. Quinton's rifle came up so fast it was almost a blur, aimed directly at Sutherland's chest. "Tell your men to stand down. I can put a bullet through your heart before any of them get a shot off, and they know it. You know it too." "You're outnumbered," Sutherland said, but his voice shook slightly. "Maybe, but you'll still be dead. Is this ranch worth dying for?" "Because your men aren't going to die for you, not once you're gone and there's no one to pay them." The standoff stretched out, tension thick enough to cut. Then one of the hired guns, a grizzled man with a scar across his cheek, carefully holstered his weapon. "I didn't sign on for murder or fighting territorial marshals. I'm out." He turned his horse and rode away slowly. One by one, the other hired guns followed. Sutherland watched them go with impotent fury, until finally he was alone facing Quinton's rifle. "This isn't over," Sutherland spat. "Yes, it is," Katherine said firmly. "You're finished in this territory. The marshal knows your name, knows your methods. Even if you run, he'll pursue charges. Your only choice now is whether you leave before he arrests you or stay and face trial for fraud and murder." Sutherland stared at her with hate-filled eyes, then jerked his horse around and spurred it into a gallop, riding away toward town. Quinton kept his rifle trained on him until he was out of range, then finally lowered it. Miguel came running over, his face streaked with soot. "Señorita Catherine." "Mr. Walker, thank God you're here. They came this morning, many men. They set fire to the barn before we could stop them. We tried to fight it, but—" "It's all right, Miguel," Catherine said, though her heart broke looking at the ruined barn, at years of her father's work reduced to ash and charred timber. "We're safe, that's what matters. We can rebuild." They spent the rest of the day fighting the fire, making sure it didn't spread to the house or the other outbuildings. By evening, the barn was a total loss, but everything else had been saved. The cattle and horses were safe in the pasture, and no one had been hurt. That night, exhausted and covered in soot, Catherine and Quinton sat on the porch again. She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, both of them too tired to do more than sit close. "We'll rebuild," Quinton said quietly. "I'll help you put up a new barn better than before. We'll make this place everything your father dreamed." "I know," Catherine said. "As long as we're together, we can handle anything." 2 days later, Marshal Carlyle arrived with 3 deputies. Vernon Sutherland had fled town the night of the standoff, but the marshal had already wired ahead to other territorial offices. He would be caught eventually, and in the meantime, Carlyle had plenty to work with. He arrested Judge Morrison on corruption charges, and the local sheriff resigned rather than face investigation. The forged loan documents were invalidated, and Catherine's ownership of the ranch was confirmed beyond any legal question. "Your father would be proud of you," Carlyle told Catherine before he left. "You fought for what was right and won." In the weeks that followed, Catherine and Quinton threw themselves into rebuilding. They couldn't prove who had actually pulled the trigger that killed Thomas Anne, but everyone in the territory knew it had been on Sutherland's orders. That would have to be justice enough. Quinton proved to be as good a rancher as he was a gunfighter, maybe better. He had a natural understanding of horses and cattle, a gift for coaxing the best out of the land without exhausting it. Together, he and Catherine designed a new barn, larger than the old one, with better ventilation and a proper tack room. Miguel and his sons helped with the construction, and several other local ranchers contributed labor in appreciation for Quinton's stand against Sutherland, who had been pressuring others before he fled. The barn raising became a community event. Tables were set up with food, children ran between the workers, and by sunset the frame was up and the roof was going on. Catherine stood watching with Rosa, Miguel's wife, and found herself smiling despite her tired feet and sore arms. "You found a good man," Rosa said, nodding toward where Quinton was working high up on the roof beam, his shirt off in the heat, muscles working as he hammered. "I did," Catherine agreed, her heart swelling with love and pride. They were married a month later in the small church in Pinos Altos. Catherine wore her mother's wedding dress, carefully preserved in a trunk, and Quinton wore a new suit purchased special for the occasion. It was a simple ceremony but meaningful, with Miguel and Rosa standing as witnesses. And afterward, there was a celebration at the ranch with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. When the last guests had finally left, and they were alone in the house that was now truly theirs together, Quinton took Catherine's hands and looked at her with such love that it took her breath away. "I promise I'll be a good husband to you," he said seriously. "I'll work hard, I'll protect you, I'll stand beside you in everything. I'll love you every day for the rest of my life." "I promise the same," Catherine said, tears of joy streaming down her face. "We're partners, equal in everything. We'll build this life together." Their wedding night was tender and sweet, a natural progression of the love that had been growing between them since that first meeting in the Lucky Star Saloon. Catherine had been nervous, but Quinton was patient and gentle, taking his time. making sure she felt safe and cherished. Afterward, lying in his arms in the darkness, Katherine felt a completeness she hadn't known was possible. The months that followed were the happiest Katherine had ever known, despite the hard work. They rose before dawn each day to tend the animals, repair fences, manage the 1,000 small tasks that kept a ranch running. But there was joy in the work because they did it together, and every improvement they made felt like building their future one board, one fence post, one season at a time. Quinton proved to have a gift for horse breeding. He purchased a fine stallion with some of his saved money and began carefully selecting mares. The goal was to produce horses that were strong enough for ranch work, but elegant enough to sell to cavalry officers and wealthy ranchers. The first foals born in the spring of 1879 were promising, and by summer, Quinton had already received inquiries about purchasing them once they were trained. In June, Katherine realized she was pregnant. The discovery filled her with a complicated mix of emotions. Joy at the thought of having Quinton's child, fear about the dangers of childbirth in a place with limited medical care, excitement about starting a family. When she told Quinton, his face lit up with such pure happiness that her fears receded. "We're going to be parents," he said wonderingly, his hand gentle on her still flat stomach. "A baby, our baby." "Are you ready for that?" Katherine asked. "I'm ready for anything as long as you're with me." He kissed her softly. "You're going to be an amazing mother." The pregnancy progressed normally through the summer and fall. Katherine continued working on the ranch, though Quinton became increasingly protective, trying to take over her heavier chores. They compromised, Katherine agreeing to rest more while Quinton agreed to stop hovering quite so much. In early February of 1880, during a cold snap that left frost on the windows, Katherine went into labor. Rosa came to help, experienced from delivering her own children and assisting other women in the area. Quinton paced outside in the cold, too nervous to sit still, until finally, after 8 hours of labor, he heard a baby's cry. Rosa opened the door, smiling broadly. "Come meet your son, Mr. Walker." Quinton rushed inside to find Katherine propped up in bed, exhausted but glowing, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up at him with tears streaming down her face. "We have a son," she said softly. "A healthy, beautiful boy." Quinton sat carefully on the edge of the bed and looked down at his son for the first time. The baby had a shock of dark hair and eyes that would probably turn blue like his father's. One tiny fist had escaped the blanket and was waving in the air. "He's perfect," Quinton whispered, touching the baby's soft cheek with one calloused finger. "What should we name him?" "I was thinking Thomas," Katherine said, "after my father, Thomas Walker." "Thomas Walker," Quinton repeated, smiling through tears of his own. "It's perfect. He's perfect." "You're perfect." The years that followed were full and rich. The horse breeding program flourished, with buyers coming from as far as Kansas to purchase the Walker horses, as they became known. The cattle herd grew steadily, and Katherine's careful management of the ranch finances meant they were soon prosperous enough to hire additional help. In 1882, Katherine gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Emma after Quinton's mother. Emma had Katherine's dark eyes and a stubborn streak that showed itself early. 2 years later came another son, Samuel, who was quiet and thoughtful from infancy. The ranch house was expanded to accommodate the growing family, with additional bedrooms added and a larger kitchen. Katherine planted a garden that grew to include vegetables, herbs, and the flowers she'd always loved. Quinton built a proper stable for his breeding stock and a corral for training young horses. Life wasn't without challenges. There were droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases and horse injuries, the normal struggles of ranching in the New Mexico territory. But Katherine and Quinton faced everything together, their partnership stronger for having been forged in the crisis with Sutherland. They heard eventually that Vernon Sutherland had been caught in California and extradited back to New Mexico to face trial. He was convicted of fraud and sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison. His associate Judge Morrison received 5 years. The corrupt sheriff had fled and was never heard from again. Miguel continued working for them until his sons were old enough to take over, then retired to a small house in town that Katherine and Quinton helped him purchase. He remained a close family friend, often visiting to spoil the Walker children with candy and stories. In the spring of 1887, young Thomas turned 7 and began helping his father with the horses in earnest. He had inherited Quinton's gift with animals, able to calm nervous colts with patience and gentle words. Watching them work together, Katherine often thought about how far they'd come from that terrible day when her father died. Thomas Ann's ranch had not only survived but thrived, becoming one of the most respected horse breeding operations in the territory. One evening in late May, Katherine and Quinton sat on the porch as they often did after the children were in bed, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The new barn stood solid and strong, the pastures were green from spring rains, and in the corral a mare nursed a foal born just that morning. "Do you remember that night I asked what you wanted most?" Katherine said, leaning against Quinton's shoulder. "I remember every moment from that time," Quinton replied, his arm coming around her. "Why do you ask?" "Because you said you wanted a life with me. And I was thinking about how much we've built, how full our life is. Did you get what you wanted?" Quinton turned to look at her, his blue eyes warm with love. "I got more than I wanted. I got everything I didn't dare dream of. A home, a family, work I'm proud of. But mostly I got you, and you're worth more than all the rest combined. I love you, Katherine Walker. I've loved you from the moment you asked for my help, and I'll love you until my last breath." Katherine kissed him softly, her heart full to overflowing. "I love you too. Thank you for staying, for building this life with me." They sat together as the stars came out, the same stars that had watched them make their promises to each other so many years before. Inside the house, their children slept safely. In the stable, the horses they'd bred together shifted in their stalls. Across the land that had cost so much but given back even more, peace settled like a blessing. The years continued to roll past, bringing new challenges and new joys. Thomas grew into a fine young man, eventually taking over much of the horse training operation. Emma proved to have her mother's head for business and began managing the ranch accounts when she was just 15. Samuel discovered a gift for working with wood and built beautiful saddles that sold for premium prices. Katherine and Quinton aged together gracefully, their love deepening with each passing year. They added more children to their family, 2 more daughters named Rose and Margaret, and watched all of them grow into capable, confident adults who understood the value of hard work and honest dealing. By the time New Mexico achieved statehood in 1912, the Walker Ranch was known throughout the region as a model operation. Katherine was in her 50s by then, her dark hair streaked with silver, her hands work-worn but still strong. Quinton's blue eyes were framed by laugh lines, and his hair had gone mostly gray, but he could still ride and work a full day when needed. They attended the statehood celebrations in Santa Fe, bringing their grown children and the first of their grandchildren. As they watched the new state flag being raised, Quinton took Katherine's hand and squeezed it gently. "Your father would be proud," he said quietly. "Proud of what you've built, how you've raised our children, the woman you are. We built it together, Katherine reminded him. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." That evening, back at the ranch that had been the center of their lives for over 30 years, the whole family gathered for a celebration dinner. The table was crowded with children and grandchildren, with laughter and good-natured arguments, and the kind of love that comes from people who genuinely enjoy being together. After dinner, as the younger generation cleaned up, Katherine and Quinton slipped outside to their favorite spot on the porch. The view was exactly as Katherine remembered from her childhood, the rolling hills and distant mountains, but everything else had changed in the best possible way. "Do you ever think about that day in the saloon?" Katherine asked. "When I walked in desperate and scared, asking a stranger for help?" "Sometimes," Quinton admitted. "I think about how different my life would be if I'd said no, if I'd sent you away. I'd still be drifting probably, alone, no real purpose beyond the next job. And I'd have lost the ranch, lost everything," Katherine said. "Or worse, if Sutherland had decided I was too much trouble." "But we didn't lose," Quinton said, pulling her close. "We fought and we won, and we built something beautiful out of the tragedy. We raised good children who know how to work hard and love deeply. We proved that people like us, ordinary people willing to stand up for what's right, can win against the powerful and corrupt." Katherine turned in his arms and kissed him, still feeling that spark that had been there from the beginning. "I'd do it all again, every hard moment, every struggle, just to end up here with you." "Same," Quinton murmured against her lips. "Every single moment." The seasons continued their eternal cycle, and Katherine and Quinton moved into the comfortable rhythm of their later years. They handed over more of the daily ranch operations to their children, but remained involved, offering guidance and wisdom earned through decades of experience. The Walker Ranch continued to thrive, now being run by the second generation, but still grounded in the principles Katherine and Quinton had established. In the summer of 1920, Katherine and Quinton celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary with a gathering that brought family from across New Mexico and neighboring states. There were over 50 people present, children and grandchildren and even a few great-grandchildren, all of them descended from the union of a desperate young woman and a cowboy who chose to help her. During the celebration, young Thomas, now a father and grandfather himself, stood to make a toast. "To my parents," he said, raising his glass, "who taught us that love isn't just a feeling, it's a choice you make every day. A choice to stand together, to work together, to build something that lasts. Thank you for showing us what that looks like." Katherine cried happy tears as the family toasted them, Quinton's arm strong around her shoulders. Later, when the guests had gone home or retired to the various bedrooms and the house was quiet, they sat together under the stars one more time. 40 years, Katherine said wonderingly. "It feels like yesterday and a lifetime ago at the same time." "Best 40 years of my life," Quinton replied. "And if we're blessed with 40 more, I'll count every day as a gift." They didn't get 40 more years, but they got another beautiful decade. They watched their grandchildren grow and marry, welcomed more great-grandchildren into the family. They celebrated Christmas and birthdays, weathered occasional setbacks, and continued to love each other with the steady, enduring devotion that had sustained them through everything. In the spring of 1930, Quinton fell ill with pneumonia. Katherine nursed him through it with the same fierce determination she'd shown in fighting Vernon Sutherland all those years ago, and he recovered, though he was weaker afterward. The family insisted they slow down, take it easier, but neither Katherine nor Quinton knew how to be idle. They celebrated Quinton's 73rd birthday that summer with a quiet family dinner. Afterward, as had become their custom, they sat on the porch watching the sunset. Quinton held Catherine's hand, his grip not as strong as it once was but still sure. "I need to tell you something," he said quietly, Catherine's heart clenched with sudden fear. "What is it?" "I'm tired, Katie." He never called her that except in their most private moments. "My body is wearing out and I can feel it. I'm not afraid of dying, but I'm afraid of leaving you." "Don't talk like that," Katherine said, though tears were already flowing. "You're going to be fine. We're going to have more years together." "Maybe," Quinton allowed. "But whether it's tomorrow or 10 years from now, I need you to know something. That moment in the saloon when you asked for my help was the moment my real life began. Everything before was just waiting. You gave me purpose, love, a family, a home. You gave me everything that matters. And when my time comes, I'll die the happiest man who ever lived because I got to spend my life loving you." Katherine was crying too hard to speak, so she just held him, this man who had been her partner, her protector, her love for over 50 years. They sat that way as the stars came out, as the cool night air settled over the ranch, holding on to each other and the life they'd built. Quinton lived another 3 years, healthy enough to enjoy his great-grandchildren and see the ranch continue to prosper. He died peacefully in his sleep in October of 1933, Katherine beside him as she had been for every important moment of their shared life. The funeral was the largest Pinos Altos had ever seen. People came from across the state to pay respects to a man who had lived with integrity and loved with his whole heart. Katherine stood strong through it all, supported by her children and grandchildren, burying her husband on the hillside next to her father, overlooking the ranch they had built together. Katherine lived another 15 years after Quinton's death, staying active in ranch operations almost until the end. She was respected throughout New Mexico as a pioneer woman who had helped shape the state, but she always said her greatest accomplishment was the life she'd built with Quinton. She passed away peacefully in 1948 at the age of 91, surrounded by 3 generations of descendants. Her last words, witnessed by her daughter Emma, were, "I'm ready. He's waiting for me." Katherine was buried next to Quinton on the hillside, their graves marked by simple stones that bore their names, dates, and a single inscription chosen by their children. Together they built a life worth living. The Walker Ranch continued through the generations, always keeping the name and the principles its founders had established. Every child born into the family grew up hearing the story of how it all began, of Katherine who refused to give up what was hers and Quinton who chose to help a stranger and found his purpose. The story of their love became family legend, passed down through the decades as an example of what real partnership looked like, what it meant to choose each other every day, through crisis and calm, through joy and sorrow. It was a reminder that the best things in life often come from the hardest fights, and that love built on mutual respect and shared purpose can weather any storm. In the years that followed, when descendants of Katherine and Quinton sat on that same porch watching the same sunset over the same hills, they sometimes felt the presence of those who came before, the spirits of a cowboy and the woman he loved, still there in the land they had fought for and the legacy they had built. And if you asked any of them what made the Walker family special, what gave them their strength and unity across generations, they would tell you about a desperate young woman who walked into a saloon looking for help, and a cowboy who looked at her and decided that her fight was his fight. They would tell you about forged documents and burning barns, about standing against corruption and winning against the odds. But mostly they would tell you about love, the kind that lasts beyond death, the kind that becomes the foundation for everything that comes after. Because in the end, Katherine and Quinton's story wasn't really about land or justice, or even survival in the harsh world of the Old West. It was about two people who found each other in the midst of tragedy and chose to build something beautiful. It was about partnership and commitment, about the courage to fight for what matters and the wisdom to know that nothing matters more than love. Their graves remained on that hillside, watched over by the mountains and the endless New Mexico sky, monuments to a life well lived and a love that never died. The ranch they built continued to thrive, generation after generation, a living testament to what Katherine Anne and Quinton Walker created together when she asked for help, and he gave her not just his gun or his protection, but his heart, his loyalty, and ultimately his whole life. In the story of the American West, full of outlaws and lawmen, gold rushes and land rushes, cattle drives and railroad expansion, the tale of Katherine and Quinton was just one small thread. But to the family they founded, to the children and grandchildren and great-great-grandchildren who still worked that land and lived by their example, it was everything. It was proof that love could triumph over greed, that justice could prevail against corruption, and that two people willing to stand together could overcome anything. And on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right across those New Mexico hills, if you listen carefully, you might hear echoes of their story in the whisper of the grass and the settling of the old house, the laughter of children who grew up loved and safe, the sound of horses that were bred with care and pride, the quiet conversations of a man and woman who sat together on a porch for 50 years, watching sunsets and planning futures, loving each other with every breath. That was the real legacy of Katherine and Quinton Walker, not just the land or the horses or the money, but the example they set of what it meant to truly live, to love without reservation, to fight for what's right, and to build something that would last long after they were gone. In a time and place where life was often short and brutal, they created something rare and precious, that one single moment of connection. When Katherine asked the cowboy what he wanted most, he looked at her and said, "A life with you," transformed not just two lives but generations to come, proving that sometimes the most powerful force in the world isn't a gun or money or power, but simply the choice to love someone completely and build a life together, come what may.